I often hear these days that faith isn't relevant. Sometimes I think that comes from a misunderstanding about what faith is and how God works in the world. Most of where we get our information about what faith is comes from the scriptures. And the Bible isn't a set of stories that comes from out there somewhere, a set of rules that somebody's trying to enforce in our lives. It's the stories, experiences, hopes, and ideas of people much like us who are trying to figure out who God is and how to love and serve Him. Those stories, when they were written down, it wasn't like the people knew that they were writing the scriptures. They knew they were writing something meaningful and important and even sacred. But those stories were an opportunity for them to mine their experience, to see how God was acting in the world they lived in. We also experience God. And sometimes we run out of ideas about how it is we connect what God is doing to our experience. And one of the ways we do that is by connecting with the stories in the scriptures. Over the 4th century, the early church leaders got together and collected those stories and ideas and thoughts that make up our Bible. And when they were finished, the Bible was finished. That means that our stories won't be included in the Bible. But that doesn't mean that God stops acting. So when we want to know how is God acting in the world today, one of the ways we do that is by allowing our stories and our experiences to connect with the God story that's given to us in the pages of the Bible. One of my favorite examples of this happening in my life comes from John 6. Jesus is telling the people who've gathered to listen to Him, "If you don't eat my body and drink my blood, you'll have no life within you." This is admittedly difficult, like many of the things that Christianity demands of us. And yet when the disciples come to Jesus and say, "Don't you want to say something easier? People are leaving." Jesus looks at them and says, "Do you also want to go?" Peter looks back at Jesus and responds, "To whom shall we go, Lord? You have the words of everlasting life." Sometimes I find it hard to be a Christian. I find it hard to love the church. I find it hard to love the people who make up the church. Perhaps hardest to love the people who sit closest to me when I go to Mass, my own children and my spouse. And yet when it gets difficult and I say to God, "Couldn't it be easier?" It's like I hear Him stepping out of the pages of Scripture and speaking right to me. Do you also want to go? I've looked around, and maybe you have too. But life isn't any easier outside of the church. There's still broken people, and I'm not perfect when I leave. And so I look back at Jesus with the eyes of faith and say, like Peter said, "To whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life." Christian life is difficult, and sometimes it can be tempting to write it all off and say, "This isn't relevant." But those experiences and stories of faith get in under our skin, and every so often we find ourselves seeing God right in front of us, asking us if we will take one more step to connect our story to God's story. Take a moment in the next little while and think about, how is God acting in my life? If I were going to be writing the stories and experiences of God's action in this time and this place, what inspiration would those who follow after me draw from God's story playing out in the story of my life?